Well, welcome everybody. This is Aaron Marshall along with Corey Miller for the second episode of our new show, Thoughtful Christianity. We are part of the ministry Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi is Latin for the reason of Christ, and we are a college campus Christian apologetics organization looking to transform lives on campus today and change culture tomorrow. We also want to just thank so much Utah Partnership for Christ. This program is funded by way of a gift from Utah Partnership for Christ. So thank you so much for your partnership with us to allow us to do this program. So, well, good morning, Corey. How's
Hey,
things
Aaron.
up in the Midwest?
It's still cold. Looking forward to summer coming sometime soon.
Yeah, we got tons of snow here in Utah this past week. As we're recording this the end of February. We got lots of snow. We're making up for all the missed snow that we didn't get in December and January here.
Yeah, I loved my time skiing there back in December, but it was lower at that time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the April snow when you tell me when we can we can ski
Sneak.
with our shirts off when it's like 70 degrees but still skiing weather. That's what I'm
Right,
looking forward
spring
to.
skiing, the best.
Yeah. Well, we last week in our first episode we just kind of talked a little bit about what Ratio Christi is, and then what this podcast or this radio show, what we're going to try to accomplish with the show. We're going to focus, we're a campus apologetics ministry, but so our focus is on the university and the intersection between apologetics and the university, and how the ideas on campus today are impacting culture tomorrow. And so what we thought we could do in this episode and then the next one is show how an idea that started off on campus and in philosophy and sort of with the, just with the eggheads, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, even 100, 150 years ago, has now leaked out into culture and is now everywhere and is totally dominating culture, both in the church and in the secular society. And most people have no idea really even what it is or how we got here, in the realm of ideas. And so I think what we can do with this is show how understanding what we believe and why we believe it and kind of how we got here with ideas, why that is so important. Because if we want to change society, we got to understand how society is thinking and why they're thinking the way that they are. So you have
Right.
written, Corey, a lot on this topic. We have a Ratio Christi ebook that people can go on our website and download on the topic of critical race theory. So most people probably listening to this have never heard of that topic. And so we're going to do our best in 25 minutes to give an overview of what that means, and then kind of let you sort of trace those ideas. How did we get here? In this, with this idea of critical race theory. So maybe I don't know, do you want to, let's define that at the beginning, and then let's kind of start from the beginning, and you can walk us through how we got where we are today on the campus.
Sure, Aaron. Richard Weaver coined the expression, ideas have consequences. And so a prominent feature of our program is to show the unilateral direction as things move from campus to culture. So ideas, the Christians, by and large, founded the universities from Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, all the way to the American universities from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, all the way into Southeast Asia. Some of the first universities in India and South Korea were all Christ-centered. And in the U.S., this was remarkable in that from 1636 to roughly 1840, every single college was Protestant, Christ-centered, and up to 1890, every college, or 1840 again, every college president was the one who really led the senior class on morality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, imagine that. Everyone was required to do church and chapel attendance up to 1890, but things began to unravel between 1880 and 1930. Some things happened where ideas began to be assimilated from Europe in the form of methodological naturalism. And as new
Okay.
scholars,
So what does that mean?
methodological naturalism isn't the same thing as, say, metaphysical naturalism, like atheism, that the world is all and only reducible to natural things like
Hmm.
space, time, matter, energy, uh, being all that there is, was, or ever will be. But it's a method. It's practicing certain methods that are consistent with naturalism, even if you are a supernaturalist. And so some that might be Christians who are practicing scientists might be under this spell and say, well, science just is, invoking all and only natural explanations to explain the phenomena.
Right.
Well, that's not a definition of science. That's more like scientism.
Right.
And so naturalism came into the universities and started to eventually take over. There were some practical considerations as well why universities started to modify, but they got rid of their core, which was Christ and the purpose of training missionaries and ministers and so forth, offering general ed type courses, but then ones that were subversive to their original founding. And by between 1880 and 1930, naturalism had effectively taken over the universities, and the Christians were by and large on the outside. Well, that was a century ago. That was phase one.
Hmm.
And you can see the changes by the names of the departments. You now called it the Department of Political Science. Politics was never a science. It was always in ethics for 2,500 years. Or the Department of Psychological Sciences. And psychology is the study of the soul. But if you look at a text in psychology today, you won't even have a reference, not a footnote, not um, a paid lip service to go in the index or the back of the book in a glossary. That it used to be the study of the soul. Now it's the study of the brain and the central nervous system. So you can see how ideas began to just pervade the entire university, and it became a scientistic entity governed by naturalistic assumptions, if anything, just in the methodologies. But that's going to affect your conclusions, and then it'll bleed out to culture.
Right. And what's also interesting is that it's in this philosophy that's driving all this, right? So it's the philosophy at the university that's
Right.
driving the science and all of these. Even today, the scientists will say it's the science, but it's the philosophy undergirding everything that's driving where all this is headed. And so this is why it's so important to study ideas, and
Right.
that's what we do.
Yeah, and in the Bible, the Apostle Paul said, beware of false philosophy.
Right.
Well, you can't be aware of it unless you are aware of it. So Christians need to, understand what's happening in our culture and where the ideas are coming from. So then enter phase two. As the dust was settling in America in the 1930s, something was happening over in Europe. The Nazi Party rose to power in Germany, and there was a new movement in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany, called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Now, these were new Marxists. The old Marxism, the classical Marxism, they believe had failed and needed some adjustment. These guys were Marxists, and most of the founders were Jews. Well, in 1933, when the National Socialist Party emerges, uh, they were socialists, but they were nationalists, and they preferred blonde hair and blue eyes. But when the National Socialist Party emerged, it's a bad place to be if you are a globalist socialist, a Marxist, and a Jew. So they had to get out of there, and they went over to America and established themselves in Columbia University, and then spread to Brandeis and the Ivy Leagues and the West Coast. And what distinguished them was this idea of cultural Marxism. It wasn't just about economics anymore, like you think of in terms of communism, class warfare between the bourgeois and the working class. No, now it's expanded to race, class, sex, gender, nationality, ethnicity, and even religion. And so every group is divided between dominant and subordinate groups, the haves and the have nots, the victims and the victimizers, the oppressed and the oppressors.
Hmm.
And the idea was that Marxism still has some merit of truth. We need to pursue it, but we need to do the slow, methodical, patient process of infiltrating the institutions, the long march through the institutions, specifically looking at non coercive elements of society society like education and religion. And so that's what they did. They came to America. They published some very influential books and tracts that got in place just in time for the 1960s student protests and sexual revolution in America. And many of those students went on into academia, and at their height, got to around the 1990s. That's when this critical theory stuff in the humanities really started to take shape. At the same time, postmodernism was taking shape, and those two formed an amalgam in certain respects, that if they had the opportunity, they would overthrow the dominant king, which is naturalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these philosophical currents moving in the waters of those universities that were once Christian.
Right.
And since then, give it 30 years later, and you're now finding that this critical theory that was birthed in the Frankfurt School, and its postmodern cousin have emerged as probably the ones taking the dominant throne in the universities, scaring the pants off of the naturalists, not knowing what to do about this Frankenstein that emerged from this lab that they let sit, and somehow it grew in the humanities. And
Right.
here we
Right.
are.
So we see the basically what you're saying is, as the university started off as Christian, Christian universities. In fact, what was the original motto at Harvard was Veritas in Christ, right?
Yeah, Veritas by the Puritans, which meant truth, capital T truth, all truth is God's truth. And then within a decade or so, they changed it to Truth for Christ in the Church. And that went from 1636 to 1936. I was there a few months ago, and that's all been scrubbed. The only
Now,
thing that's left is Veritas, and it doesn't mean capital T truth, but I can see still the etchings in the wall. They have the whole expression on some of their buildings.
right. So now it's just truth, which we'll talk about. So, but what do we mean by truth, right? So you see
Yeah.
in the first phase, the naturalists sort of dominate, and it's just everything it's naturalism, methodological naturalism, like you said. And then we see the shift over now to the more postmodern. What do what's your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. And as we gravitate towards that, then it becomes easy for epistemological, that's just the way we think about reality, claims or paradigms to begin to dominate that that wouldn't have 100 150 years ago. And
Yeah.
you're saying, and we're saying at the university, that is critical theory, critical race theory. So if someone's never heard of this, what would be one or two or three of the sort of the dominant bullet points, you could say, or principles within critical race theory as it's sort of taken over the university in the last 5, 10, 15 years?
Sure. And I would say, to not scare away members of our audience, critical theory is an expression that is academic and sometimes scares people. It confuses people. It often makes academics' eyes glaze over, too. Another term that's synonymous with it is called social justice.
Okay.
In
Yeah.
pop culture, we might call it identity politics. We might call it neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. If any of those make sense, look at those as throwing socks on the wall. And if one of them sticks, you're probably landing in the basic vicinity of what this is.
Right.
So we can call it social justice or critical social justice, critical theory. And some of the basic tenets of it, I like to think about it because I'm trained in philosophy. So the three major branches are reality, knowledge, and ethics. And you can look at reality on the bottom as the foundation to the building, and theory of knowledge is second, and then ethics is on top. You don't do your ethics until you deal with the other stuff below. So what is real? How do I know what is real? How should I then live based on what I know about reality? Well, what's their view of reality? These social justice proponents, or critical theoretical or neo-Marxist proponents. Their idea originally, because Marxism is naturalistic, it's atheistic, is that there is no God, there's no purpose to life, and so forth. But their view of human nature in particular, their view of that reality, is that humans are in this juxtaposed, interlocking opposition. It's very divisive between the haves and the have-nots, the oppressors and the oppressed, the victimizers and the victims, the bourgeois and the proletariat, and they're always vying for power. You've got the ruling class, and someone needs to overthrow them. The working class, and eventually they'll become the new ruling class.
Mm-hmm.
And Marxism says that'll eventually wither away. But the if that's the problem, that you've got this inequality. Now, inequality was a mathematical term, but now it's become primarily an ethical term, the only ethical term that matters these days, equality. So anytime you have an inequality or a disparity, lurking there is an injustice. If you hear the word inequality in culture now, it just means injustice. So if you have nots or oppressed or victims, that's a social, it's a group idea, a group injustice, identity powers. You have this problem of social injustice, social inequality. So the solution, the ethical solution, is going to be social justice, social equality. And the way that we know about these things can't be by logic or facts or anything like that, really. It's by listening to the victims,
Right.
listening to the oppressed, listening to those who have lived experience over logic. And that's called standpoint theory. And it's the idea that certain people are woke, they're awakened, they're enlightened. It's the new enlightenment to these problems. And those who are part of the oppressors, whether they know it or not, whether they like it or not, whether they've introspected and thought about it or not, they're part of the problem and they just can't see it. So they just need to sit and listen. And so you've got the problem of the human nature and the group identities in fights with one another. You've got the ultimate solution being to equal those out by coercion if necessary. And you've got the way we know about these things is through listening to those who are in the know, who have moral authority, and that is oppressed groups. Some of these oppressed groups are going to have multiple group statuses,
Right.
like being a black female or a black gay female. There's three levels of oppression right there. And then the way they communicate is through language, meta narratives, using linguistic discourse. They call it hegemonic discourse. It's a story that the ruling class tells to justify its power. And this is where the Bible becomes the ultimate colossal hegemonic oppressor, and God is the ultimate oppressor.
So yeah, so I mean, there's obviously way too much to even to get into in one 30-minute show, but but the idea is that we're no longer talking, because we've gone from the the modern to the postmodern, as we talked about earlier. We're no longer talking about truth, capital T, as in what corresponds to reality. We're
Right.
talking about lived experience, like you said, and lived experience trumps, no pun intended, lived experience trumps, any ideas. In fact, we would say that truth, they would say that truth is, you try to use truth to override someone's lived experience, is actually a function of white imperialism and these kind of things.
Right.
And so all of this is, let's just say someone's listening to this and they're saying, look, this sounds really high level. This sounds, it sounds like there's just a bunch of weird stuff going on in the university. How is this practically playing out at the university? So what are we seeing at the university now that, that we didn't see 20 years ago because of this way of thinking? And then remember, next week we're going to talk about how this is playing out in culture. But how is this affecting the university besides just these academic discussions that that you and I love to have, but maybe other people might not think are as interesting?
Right. It's affecting the university in the sense that the telos, or the goal of the university, the purpose, the mission of the university used to be the pursuit of truth. Now it is the pursuit of social justice, defined in the terms that we've just unpacked. And atheists have recognized this, like Jonathan Haidt, NYT scholar, psychologist, and New York Times best-selling author. It's moving quickly to being a social justice university, not a truth university. Truth is said to be one of those things that the hegemonic powers to be, the ruling class, uses to keep their subordinates in check. It has formed the root of what we would call cancel culture today. And it's not just conservatives now that are being canceled. And I've got plenty of eyewitness testimonial experience on that one. But it's also liberals. It's also liberal atheists that were, classically liberal. They would embrace, as we would, the statement that emerges out of the thoughts of Voltaire, the deist, who said, um, I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. Well, they no longer believe that. Some of them do, but they're not the social justice, the critical theory, the neo-Marxist types. Those types stand more with something that Stalin may well have said. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We don't allow our enemies to have guns. Why should we let them have any ideas? So that's what's happening.
So, all right. So, again, what's what's a practical, or what's a story or two for someone to say, I see what you're saying. Ideas have consequences. I think we all agree on that. But what's an example of ways in which this is playing out in lived experience?
Well, people getting canceled, campus ministries like Ratio Christi now having to be in federal court almost constantly to just exist. It's not just about free speech anymore. Free speech presupposes cognitive liberty, free thinking. It used to be the atheists that were the free thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're just trying to get equal airtime. We're just trying to exist on campus as Christians, conservative Christians or not, because now they're even going after atheists who may not agree with the new ruling class narrative.
So, like, what's one example of where Ratio Christi is in litigation and I know we're in multiple litigations, but what's one example where this has played out with us having to file a lawsuit?
Yeah, we've got 2 federal victories so far. We've got one in federal court in the 8th district um, over the idea of insisting that our leaders of our groups actually be Christians. Crazy. We have one that we're part of at the Supreme Court right now. Oral arguments were given in January, and the verdict will be rendered probably in May, dealing with speech zones, speech codes, and free speech. And then one that we entered into litigation with last week involves a rule that the Trump administration put in through the Department of Education, a regulation that protects religious groups on campus so that if universities want to pounce on them for their viewpoint diversities that they might have, that the university no longer has, then those clubs can still exist. And the university, by contrast, might be risking federal funding if it's a public university. And so the Secular Student Alliance, who has become incredibly woke, and the American Atheists have filed suit to remove that regulation. And knowing full well that the Biden administration would take over the next day after they filed suit. So Ratio Christi entered in as intervening interventionists, intervening defendants on behalf of the Department of Education, because we have standing and something to lose here, as does every club.
Right, and I think the problem is a lot of the other Christian clubs don't realize how dangerous position we're in, and they're not willing to litigate, and certainly we are. So we're out of time. I know there's just so much you can talk about on this issue. What's final thoughts from Corey Miller? 15, 30 seconds on this topic.
Coming back to Richard Weaver's statement, ideas have consequences. Things generally move from campus to culture, and if you see pollution downstream, you need to go upstream to ultimately solve it, and that's at the university.
And that's what we're trying to do with the ministry of Ratio Christi is, change. We want to change the culture or change the campus today and then change culture tomorrow. So again, email us at info@ratiochristi.org if you have comments or suggestions for future episodes. We will talk about this same topic next week as we dive into how it's affecting the culture, the church, and all those around us today. So thank you for listening to this episode of Thoughtful Christianity.